episode of the CGSP Roundtable. We're streaming live on YouTube and on LinkedIn and I think on Facebook, but not sure. Very happy Friday to my good friends, Cobus van Staden in Cape Town. Still can't get used to that, Cobus. You've been in Johannesburg for such a long time. And Jeronima joining us, as always, from the beautiful island of Mauritius. Good afternoon. Happy Friday, guys.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
It's great
Hi.
to be here.
So we're going to do what we did last time, which we did this a couple of weeks ago. And by the way, the comments on Facebook and on LinkedIn were so nice. And, you know, you don't take that for granted in this day and age that people say nice things to you on social media. So that is not something that we are that accustomed to. And so anyway, we've got some great topics for you lined up. I think you're going to see Jose Fernandez there, who we're going to hear from very soon as well, talking about the Mineral Security Partnership. Let's dive into that. Giraud, let's get to you very quickly. Tell us a little bit about this the Mineral Security Partnership deal, because this is what happened on the sidelines of the United Nations. You've got Jose Fernandez there, who's the Undersecretary of State for, what's his title? Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. Most of our discussion today is going to take place on what's happened in New York on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. This was a big deal. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about this Mineral Security Partnership deal.
So basically, the Mineral Security Partnership is that alliance that's created in June 2022 by the US, gathering 14 countries and the European Union countries together to form an alliance into how to secure supply chain of critical minerals. It was at that time where the worry has become so large about China's dominance on that supply chain. They decided to create an alliance to be able to start building up supply chain, so to rely on each other to really secure those minerals. The idea even came before the IRA, because IRA later on came, but the MSP really was that founding structure, the first really founding structure, gathering G7 countries and other countries, allied countries, to be able to do that.
Yeah, so
what's
we're looking
happening
at the
in
map
New York,
here of these countries. Tell me a little bit about the profile of the Mineral Security Partnership. And again, I haven't heard you say the magic word here. Why was the Mineral Security Partnership made? There was a very clear reason.
No, yes, that's as I say, it was because of China. It was China dominance over the critical minerals. Yes, yeah, that was the idea. The idea was really to make sure that they really create a supply chain and find resources to create supply chain that can really decouple them as much as possible from China's. That's why they created the MSP. You do have countries like the US, Canada. You do have EU countries, as you see in the map. You also have Australia on the map, because Australia is one of the main producers of lithium and other critical minerals that you do find in the world. Australia has a huge part of it in terms of production. So having all those countries together was the idea to say, okay, how are we working together to make that happen, to really now starting to counter China's influence? That was in June 2022. So all over between June 2022 and now, there's been a lots of engagement made by Jose Fernandez, traveling in Japan, traveling in Latin America, in Chile, in Bolivia, really trying to get as much as creating as much as possible that strong alliance that he wants to build to be able to counter China. And later on, they started really to go with a country like Japan, for example. When Japan signed the deal, MOUs with the DRC, it was really that idea that, the MSP is really enlarging and moving parts. But in the same time, you also had Europe itself putting its own critical minerals initiative on the map online, the different initiatives put on the map at the same time. You also have Canada doing the same thing, Australia doing the same thing. So despite the fact that you had the MSP where the US was gathering everyone, you also have each country having his own policy on the ground. So earlier this year, the US say, maybe we should be able to kind of make sense, to find a way to connect certain aspects of our strategies with certain aspects of EU strategies to be able to coordinate our actions. Because the reality on the ground was the fact that you do have MSP initiative of one country, at least quote unquote initiative. At the same time, you also have single countries initiative in the same space. So it was like they really started to walk on each other's feet. So the idea was like, okay, how do we make sense of it and how do we coordinate? Because that was one of the big challenges that they do have. So coming to that event, the idea now became like, okay, we realized that, and Jose Fernandez said it himself, realized that we cannot tackle on China ourselves because as a single country, individual country, we really cannot be able to do that. So we have to pull our resources together, financial resources, coordination, to be able to finance projects by private industries to be able to counter it. Because the reality was the fact that they realized that private companies, despite all those initiatives, were still in the ideas that, we're gonna go where the money is. If the money is with Chinese companies, we're gonna go with Chinese companies. And that was it was kind of starting to defeat all different initiatives that all those countries started to put in together. So say, okay, let's now create a financial structure where those companies can receive funding and financing for their project in different parts of the world. Yeah, that's basically, I tried to sum it up. That's basically what was it about, that event.
No, that's very helpful. Let's take a listen now, if I can get this to play. We'll listen to what Jose Fernandez said at this event, and I want you to tell us a little bit about the event and why it was important. But let's first hear from Jose Fernandez.
In June of 2022, we launched a Mineral Security Partnership, the MSP, which now includes 14 countries, plus the European Union. We collectively account for over 50% of the world's GDP. And our aim in the MSP is to catalyze public and private sector investments in strategic.
Oh, okay. So there you go. He wants to catalyze private and public, investments. That's the U.S. objective here. How successful have they been in this initiative, and what should we make of this event in New York on the sidelines?
There are different events. There are different projects that have been launched under the MSP. Some of them successful, some of them less successful. You have some of them in Latin America, but there's not really real clarity in terms of like how successful and in terms of launching, in terms of being in production, they've been so far. They've identified 10 projects that they say we're gonna try to focus as much as possible on this 10 projects, and we're gonna be trying to finance them to move forward on that. So the question, so at this point, it's gonna be too early to kind of say that the MSP has been successful, because so far the data are showing us that, it's still not really what's expecting. China is still much more dominant and everything. You still have private companies, European, Western private companies trying to make deals with Chinese companies in critical minerals, not only in Africa, but in Latin America and elsewhere in Asia. So you all have all those contexts. So it's really early to say if it has been successful as initiative itself. I know Jose Fernandez, if he listens, is going to say, we've been having all those MOUs, those protocols, those agreements, those countries and everything. But have we identified a project successful that's been launched under the MSP? Not so far. We still have some project they're working on. And second, based on this event here, because we had financial institutions, DFIs from different countries being part of the event, we had private companies, we have mining companies as well. Certain mining companies, it was reported that Rio Tinto was going to be, Rio Tinto and BHP are going to be there. You also have US DFIs, European DFIs, all of them, trying to get as much Goldman and Sachs, trying really to get like public financing, private financing, to really work together in saying, okay, we have to create a financial structure that's going to help us finance those critical minerals projects. So now we're going to have to see how coordinated they're going to be, how clear and how effective they're going to be, because the more you have people like this, the more it becomes difficult in terms of coordination, because the reality is in Europe, you have people with different kind of feelings. Some say we may not need to compete with China. We may need to a certain extent to cooperate with China where it's possible to be done. And some say, we may need. So you have all different views that even within the EU itself, it's much more complicated to make. So it's going to be much more complicated if now you expand to all those members together to coordinate all of that. So you're going to have to wait and see how successful they're likely to be.
So, Jerome, one part of it that I didn't 100% get was, like judging by the map, you mentioned Australia as one producer country being, kind of being involved. It seemed judging by the map, maybe Chile is involved as well. But where are all the other countries that are actually where the minerals actually come from? Like, are they not in this conversation, or is it really only about like offset markets and financing, not about like the actual mining itself?
The interesting with the MSP, they like sidelines. They like UNGA sideline events. And the first one they got in 2022 was really big. It was also on the sideline of a UNGA event where they invited some African countries being part of the conversation. You had the DRC, you had Mozambique, you had Namibia, you had Tanzania as observers just coming and saying, taking a look and see what's going to happen. They really try to include them in the conversation. This different indiscretion that we got from different people in those countries, they're telling us that, they've tried to enroll those countries in that initiative, to put them in that initiative, to be formal members, to really being part of that. But those countries so far, they've been reluctant into the idea to say that if we do come into that formal structure, it means that we are picking side. And all of them so far, they've been saying we don't want to pick side. So this is the part where it's getting complicated. As much as the US would like to have, for example, the DRC, the Mozambique, the Tanzania, and the Zambia really being formal members of the MSP, those countries are saying that, guys, it's your beef with China. We'd rather not being part of it. Us, we are welcome. We are welcoming everybody who's coming with the money, with the structure and everything to come and invest. So this is now, that's why you don't see the Zambias, the Mozambique, and the Bolivias in part of the MSP.
Well, let me give you a reason why the U.S. is so anxious to get the MSP going. This is a graphic that came out, I think, from the Visual Capitalist about 2 or 3 weeks ago. But here's what you're going to see here. You're going to see right here that China, 65% of lithium. China is also a top processor. China, in terms of cobalt, 74% of processing. I presume that's processing. Yeah, so there's the mining, there's the processing. Also on natural graphite, 100%. And then in rare earths, 90% of processing, 70% of mining. China in natural graphite, 72% of mining. The question that I have, Giraud, is that when we look at these numbers, and what Fernandez was saying was that there's been a lot of progress. There's been a lot of, they've made a lot of deals. I think they said they're doing up to 30 deals that they're going to be unfolding. This is a lot of road they have to make up in order to be competitive.
Oh, yes, definitely.
We still haven't seen the implementation of large processing plants in the US, Europe, and Japan. I find that hard to believe that those large processing facilities will ever make it to those countries because of the environmental regulations being
there
what
is
they
a new
are.
one,
They're very
though.
strict.
There is one new
a recycling plant, right? Or
there
is
is
not?
no. There is one new lithium processing that was built in Germany, and that was launched recently in Germany. And they're going to get the lithium from Argentina or Chile, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
So you do have those kind of initiatives, but to the scale
Is it
that
enough
we
to
see,
make up this gap?
No, of
Look
course.
at this gap.
Of course,
it's
those
huge.
The gap is huge. It's massive, and this is the part where the question becomes: to build those processing in the US, in Europe, at the scale the market requires, the industry wants it, and at the scale to compete with China, what China has been building for years, it's gonna take years. It's gonna take money, and it's gonna take a lot of taking shortcuts in their own regulations, because as you mentioned a few weeks back in the book that we are reading, the lithium, the war below, is the fact that you do have an armada of regulation in Europe, in the US, that really comes in all type of direction that you may want to do something. The politicians may want to do something to make something happen. But when it comes to really implement it, they're going to have to go through others. Because in that MSP, you didn't have environmental NGOs. You didn't have human rights organizations. You didn't have all those organizations in Europe, in the US, or elsewhere in the G7 country. That may be part of the discussion when it's about launching new mining processing or launching new mines. in those countries. So yes, this is going to be much more difficult to implement, especially in the US. That's why they're looking into what they're thinking of doing. They're creating a kind of structure where the money is coming from their countries, but the money is coming from their countries, but the mining is coming from the Chiles, the Bolivia, the Tanzanian, for example. So they say, we know that we cannot mine it here in the US or in Canada or here and there, but we're gonna try to mine them in other countries. Basically, they're kind of outsourcing the cost of mining in those producing countries than putting them in their own countries. So yeah, this is one of the tricky situations
that's what they've been doing.
That's happening.
Because nobody wants this in their backyard. Nobody wants a nickel, smelting plant in their backyard.
Yeah,
Cobus, you'll take it in South Africa or the DRC because you have no other choice. People want the jobs, people want the industry. They talk about moving up the value chain. But anybody that has a choice is going to say, no, I don't want that in my country. I don't want that in my community, regardless of what the national security implications are.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's of course the larger story behind China's rise as well. Is that all of these externalities, both environmental and labor were kind of offshored to China, and then and then Europe and the US could claim kind of high regulations and great standards. That's unfortunately the side of the story that's not told so much.
Yeah, I mean, so, well, let's continue on with our discussion at the United Nations. It's been a fascinating week, and Cobus, you've been writing about this all week in terms of what has been going on in a number of other kind of spaces and topics that are going. Oh, actually, before we move on, Gero, I wanted to actually make one other point on this, that your colleagues over at Carnegie sent out a fascinating chart. And this is still on mining, but I really want to share this one and dive into this.
Oh, yeah.
This is an update on a chart that we had talked about a couple of years ago. And this I want to give credit to. Remember, there was a scholar who we interviewed quite a few times by the name of Nsetse Were in Kenya, one of the smartest people that we've had on the show in the 15 years we've been broadcasting the show. And she kept talking about the need to put Chinese activities in Africa in context. We talk about this in debt a lot, that the Chinese amount to about 11% of Africa's total debt. And then she kind of tuned us into this idea that Chinese mining, in terms of the exports of what comes out of Africa to, that are controlled by the Chinese, then that was about 5 or 6 years ago, amounted to about 11% or 12% of total mining. New data that Carnegie Endowment put forward in their newsletter earlier in September shows that the total output is 6.7%. Did that surprise you, Jérôme?
Not really. It really doesn't surprise me because when you look at the mining industry in Africa in terms of history, in terms of background, it's not really surprising because just based out of colonization history, then it's normal to have much more Western European countries in those spaces in Africa. And mind you, China is a new mining country. It's not an old mining country compared to Australia, compared to Canada. China is a new kid on the block when it comes to large mining companies. So why China has been attracting attention and all over the place? Because when we start talking about mining in Africa for the last 10, 15 years, we start talking about that under the spectrum of those important industrial minerals, copper, cobalt, and everything. Once you do that, you really simplify the sphere by like 1-2 countries, the DRC, Zambia, and the other countries. And when you look at those countries, of course, you're going to see a large presence, ultra dominance of Chinese presence in the DRC in Zambia. So from there, people start to extrapolate, China is dominating the mining industry in Africa. And it became a shortcut that people take in the narrative about China mining industry. But when you open now to the whole mining industry, all over Africa in different minerals, this is the reality. And mind you, in this chart, this is what really made me smile, is the fact that they put Chinese company as a grouping, comparing them with single companies like Anglo-Americans, Glencore, First Quantum, Impala, and all. And you realize that if you do break down those group of Chinese companies as single companies, they were gonna be really, really far behind in terms of like mining output and presence in Africa. And this is really important to put all those data out there in perspective, so people, when they have the debate, they say, okay, what are we talking about here? Instead of like just,
I mean,
taking shortcuts in what we when we
you
talk
would
about those
think
topics.
from the discourse, Cobus, that the Chinese have 80% of output of African mining. I mean, you would think that it is so hyperbolic in terms of the way that people talk about the Chinese. And again, our point here in having this discussion is not to defend the Chinese in any way here, but it's rather to put their role in Africa in the proper context. And 6.7% is a very small number. And again, it also mirrors, Cobus, when we look at foreign direct investment. China historically has been one of the smaller investors in Africa. It's been dominated by the colonial powers, the ex-colonial powers. That's the case in mining and in debt as well. But yet, when you hear the discussions that happen in Europe and the US, this context is always missing. And I just think this number is so important. 6.7% is tiny.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you compare that to the level of hysteria that one sees in in Western discussions around Chinese death grip on on minerals, African minerals, it's really quite something. And I mean, at the same time, I think the important thing to point out is that as Giraud was saying, China is a newcomer, and it's stepped into a context that's still almost completely dominated by Western power. That, and I think that's a really important thing to point out, because even though it's obvious, it's never said, it's never acknowledged. Kind of least of all in the West. Giraud, I was wondering, the 50% kind of labeled as other, like who would be some of the people kind of involved in that part?
I think it would be all the others, different companies, all the other different countries, and because you do have Indonesians, you do have Kazakhstan, right? You have all those tiny projects being.
Where's Eurasia Group in all of this?
Exactly, of course, Eurasia Group. Yeah. When you put at the scale of all African mining, like there's really tiny, and I think that's why even we see Chinese companies on the map only because they put them in grouping. If they remove them as a grouping, as individual, I wouldn't be surprised they've been finding themselves in others as well, because they're gonna be so tiny in terms of output and everything. So because mining in Africa, it's not only copper and cobalt, it's so many things that we don't always talk about, and we tend to just put aside all those topics, all those minerals, because they're not they're not on the forefront, they're not today the hot topic that we talk about. But when you open them, you're gonna have diamonds, platinum, you're gonna have so many things that you can talk about mining that space where Chinese are not even present. Diamond, for instance, you'll be like, but they won't be mentioned in those kind of spaces.
Well, let's move on with our discussion back to the UN, as I wanted to go to, and just for you guys to kind of get a vision of what was happening there all week. It was a busy week there. Let me just pull up, particularly as it relates to Lebanon and the war that's unfolding there. So we saw a lot of activity by the Chinese, Cobus, that we were looking at. And you're seeing video here of the Chinese prime minister meeting with his Lebanese counterpart on Tuesday, I think it was, or let's see. Yeah, that was probably Monday or Tuesday. The real fighting kicked off on Monday. And China came out very strongly in support of the Lebanese and really articulating a very forceful response to the Israeli bombardment. Cobus, what was your take on terms of how the Chinese position themselves in this conflict?
I think, there's always this discussion about whether China wants to replace the US, kind of as some kind of security provider or mediator and so on in the Middle East, and I always tend to think no. here I think China is again trying to kind of position itself. It's part of a slightly different project, which is to build new norms and ongoing kind of permanent coalitions across the global south around kind of shared talking points. And here I think China is again kind of positioning itself as a leader of the global south, a kind of de facto leader of the global south, someone speaking for the rest of the world, and being the one voice, the one Security Council member who's now voicing some of the disapproval. I think that around these attacks, because I think most of the rest of the debate ends up being quite kind of shaped by US kind of priorities. So I think in this case, like, China's increasingly kind of positioning itself, I think, for its own kind of larger, beyond the Middle East, kind of larger political reasons, as the kind of the big head in a complex family of the global south, kind of like speaking together about this crisis.
And mind you, it's really coming just right after FOCAC, where in the final declaration they mentioned the crisis in Gaza. FOCAC, where China really positioned itself as the lead of as one of the main leaders, if not the lead of the global south. So having a crisis like this in the Middle East, still, as you say, Kobe, China is really putting itself in a position where I'm really becoming the voice of the global south and really taking that role as leader for speaking for the marginal countries that are left out of the international rule-based order.
Let's hold that thought a little bit, because we're going to be hearing from India's external affairs minister, who also wants to lay claim to that. Let me try and play you some sound right now from China's envoy to the United Nations, Fu Cong, and then you can see the subtitles that are there, and he is forcefully defending Lebanon's sovereignty.
强烈谴责违反国际关系基本准则的行为。正当世界各国领导人齐聚纽约，在联大辩论中发出维持中东和平的压倒性呼声，以色列选择在此时扩大战事，不啻是对国际公义和国际法权威的嘲弄。中东地区承受不起一场新的战争，当务之急是制止军事冒险，推动局势降温。
So Kobus, there it is from Fu Cong saying that they made that Israel's making a mockery of the international system there, and he didn't, of course, as they've not said from the beginning, never mentioned the fact that Hezbollah fired missiles into Israel. Never mentioned, of course, they've never mentioned Hamas by name as a terrorist organization. So again, we talked about this on our show earlier this week. There's a legitimate critique of the Chinese to say their claim to be non-aligned in this conflict is kind of BS.
Maybe. I think yes. I mean, I think each side is choosing which particular kind of part of this crazy polycrisis they're emphasizing. I think like one thing is that China is playing a diplomatic role here. So for example, in bringing the different Palestinian factions together. So there are diplomatic reasons, to not call these people out in public. Kind of considering it's behind the scenes role. On the other hand, I think also it is acknowledging that from the perspective of the global south, this isn't a both-sidism situation, right? Kind of because the occupation and the large kind of history of of Israel's relationship with its neighbors and with the Palestinians puts a certain context there, that also has to be taken into account. Is my guess of what this kind of thinking is there. But I don't know what you think.
I think there is a Go ahead. No. I do think there is China is playing, in terms of China not speaking a side. I think they already picked a side long time ago. They've chose a side of what they have defined as presented as to be the victim of Israel war and Israel domination in the region. Even in this crisis, the position they take about Lebanon and everything, because the Hezbollah and the Hezbollah is reacting and acting on behalf of Gaza's people and everything. So in that not mentioning the Hezbollah, there is a sense of like, there is a kind of notion of self-defense that's happening here in the region. And if Hezbollah is firing missiles in Israel, it's kind of a response to what China is, what Israel has been doing since October 7th. So they're like, yeah, there is a quote-unquote kind of legitimacy behind that.
You're into
behind
very
that element.
treacherous territory here, my
Yeah,
good
I
friend.
know
You're
here
into
people
very,
people won't be
careful
people
there.
won't be happy about it. But this is the context, to put the context. This is why, for example, you have the debate of like, is it Hezbollah legitimating how they're reacting or not? Because at some point, when you look at the way Israel is behaving, people are becoming, where do you mentioned earlier, I'm going to take back a bit. You mentioned earlier how the US is reacting to that. It was fascinating in these attacks of those pages attack, the way the medias in French, in Europe, in the UK, in Europe, in the US, they talk about it. They talk about it with so much admiration. Wow, it's amazing. Yeah. It's targeted. It's that. But guys, do you get that
Australia,
civilians
I saw someone being like, it's so smart. Like,
exactly. Do you get that civilians have been killed? Come on.
Okay, but so what was it in the DRC and Mauritius? What was the way that if the West in their media talked about it in glowing terms, how was it covered in the DRC and Mauritius?
And glowing in DRC and Mauritius, people didn't care that much. It's like, oh, okay, because they've been not reporting what France 24 has been saying. Oh, okay. There's not really sense of like, oh, it's something, but people be thinking, okay, that's strange. But the admiration that they talked about it on Western media, you're like, guys, as if like we forget that those pages exploded in markets, in the streets, in hospitals, where people really, collateral people died out of those kind of operations. So at some point when Israel talks about it, like, when China is talking about it, it's going to talk about it in the sense of like, I'm talking in the name of the victims, that really something wrong is going on here and someone needs to name it, to shame it, and to talk about it. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves just being so amazed by how CNN, BBC are talking about that. But those are somehow state terrorist attack on civilians in another country.
That's again highly in dispute. That is, they would say that those pagers were owned by members of Hezbollah, and they were attacking legitimate military targets. That is
civilians around.
Well, there's civilians around, but again, the target of the attacks were military. Fair enough, but I mean, again, there are multiple sides to this. I just don't want us to necessarily get sucked into this. But Cobus, go ahead. What was the coverage in South Africa, in particular, because South Africa has taken such a strident line against Israel in this conflict? How did the media there cover not only the attacks, but also now ongoing with Hezbollah and the war in Lebanon?
Big condemnation. The South Africans are, I think understandably upset. They are, they like it's been condemned. I think like really roundly. And I think a lot of South Africans remember these kinds of booby traps and these, like, because the apartheid murder squads use these techniques. They also sent exploding devices to people, and of course it later came out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they were trained by the Mossad. So the Mossad was instrumental in setting up the apartheid kind of death squad system, which were also used in neighboring countries. So the clearest precedent to this is late apartheid, because they were literally sending exploding packages to people's offices in neighboring countries around Africa and in Europe. So that is, for South Africans, that's the clearest parallel, and it's not a good parallel. Particularly because the Israelis were directly involved in that too, and because I think and this comes back to China's stance, is that the problem there is seen as a settler colonial project driven by Western empire. It's not Israel is it's Israel's position as a state is seen in the South African context, in this apartheid and empire context, and I think that is the dominant view of Israel, I think, from around the global south, and it's certainly been is strengthened by the last 2 weeks.
And that goes back to the China question, which is that I think for the Chinese, just in pure political terms, they see this as a winning issue for them. They see that by aligning themselves with the vast majority of countries that are, just passionately opposed to what Israel is doing in Gaza, in the West Bank, and now in Lebanon, that's a winning issue for them. And I think we talked to Jonathan Fulton earlier this week, who is the great China Mideast scholar based out of the UAE. And he also emphasized what the relatively low stakes there are for the Chinese in the Middle East, in the sense that it's not a geopolitical priority for them anywhere near what it is in Asia and with the U.S.-China kind of face-off in that respect. And so they can take these much bigger positions on these issues because the stakes are quite low for them in that respect. And I think the political gains are significant on that front. Let's stay with the United Nations, and now we're going to move to one of my favorite politicians, the External Affairs Minister, or otherwise known as the Foreign Minister of India, by the name of S. Jaishankar. This guy speaks truth to power in ways that nobody else really does. Guys, I'm going to play you 3 sound bites from the past couple of weeks, back 2 weeks, where he's been talking both at the United Nations and then in New York to the Asia Society, and then also in Switzerland. And I just want to get your response to what he said. Let's take a listen. If I can get the video to play.
First,
there we go.
Is the reform of the UN and its subsidiary bodies. The world has evolved into a smart, interconnected, and multipolar arena, and its members have increased 4-fold since UN's inception. Yet the UN remains a prisoner of the past. As a result, the UN Security Council struggles to fulfill its mandate of maintaining international peace and stability, undermining its effectiveness and credibility. Without reforms, including expansion in both categories of UNSC membership, its lack of effectiveness will only continue. Expansion and proper representation in the permanent category is a particular imperative. Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the global south, cannot continue to be shortchanged. They must be given their legitimate voice. Real change needs to happen, and happen fast.
There he says it. It's a prisoner of the past. And he says it's broken. It's just not fulfilling its mission. Now, let's kind of keep your comments there. Now we have a great clip from him talking about the G7 as well, and I think he'll get his comments on this.
G7, I fully agree with you. But since then, the G20 has been created during the financial crisis, and it was a good answer to a difficult moment. And that's why, considered maybe from the north, we don't see why the BRICS was necessary, given the fact that the G20 exists. But I heard your answer.
Yeah, but I must tell you, I'm still struck by how insecure the North is when you speak about the BRICS. Somehow something seems to get under people's skin.
Yeah.
And here's an observation. G7, if there is a G20, did the G7 disband? Has it stopped meeting? No, it still continues. So if the G20 exists, the G20 is there, but the G7 still exists. Then why can't the G20 be there and the BRICS also exist? So we're all constituents.
Yeah, excellent answer as always. Thank you very much. Of course, one key question is about the relationship between India and China. We have seen difficult moments.
He goes on, and then let's go on with this about more on the BRICS.
Stepping back to the Quad, which you mentioned, and your overall remarks about the emergence of more both regionalism and multipolarity, I wrestle with what seems, to me at least, as something of a conundrum of India's simultaneous active membership in both the Quad and the BRICS, and for that matter, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
We can chew gum and walk at the same time.
All right, but can can you be all things to all people and all regions? Does that really work?
Look, it's not that we are all things to all people. We are ourselves to all people. And the idea that countries must operate in a particular context or a particular structure, that's a very post-45 Cold War-ish idea. Times have moved on. So there are today a lot of countries who feel that their freedom of choice, their operational flexibility should not be constrained because their interests are much more complicated and much more diverse than the binary picture which the Cold War era represented. So, certainly this, what I say applies to India, but look at the BRICS. You have today countries like UAE or Egypt or Saudi Arabia. Now, these are countries which have had strong relations with the West, still have strong relations with the West. So it's not like by being in the BRICS or being in SCO, you are necessarily sort of turning your back on your other relationships. I think it is that ability to operate in multiple contexts and multiple spaces, and that to me is a characteristic of the current era.
Well, can you help?
Okay, so Cobus, you see the West in many respects, just as embodied by some of these questions that Jaishankar is getting, struggling with the idea of a more forceful global South. I think, Géraud, as you pointed out, the Chinese are trying to be a voice of the global South. In many ways, because of Jaishankar's ability to push back in confidence in having these conversations with people like Danny Russell from Asia Society and in places like Zurich, and the Chinese, they don't have those kinds of discussions. And when they do get into those discussions, it ends up being very polarized, that, falling into the US-China kind of thing. But here we have Jaishankar really pushing back and saying, guys, your thinking is outdated. He said that both at the UN and in the interview with Danny Russell. Let's start with you, Cobus. What's your reaction to the various comments from Jaishankar?
I think he makes a strong point. Like he was also in the same conversation. He was also saying that in specifically in relation to India-China relations, that the future of Asia will be multipolar, and it's increasingly becoming multipolar. So he rejects the India versus China narrative, which admittedly Narendra Modi, his boss, does tend to go for a little bit more. But still, kind of I think he's reflecting a reality, I think, kind of because of the as more and more global South countries become stronger, we're going to see a multiplication of voices. There isn't going to be one of them kind of like now somehow standing in for everyone else. The point of that is that there's more and more voices.
Yes, and definitely, I do believe that India is playing its own card, as he said himself. That we are not for, we are not against, we are not everyone to everybody. We are just we are ourselves to everybody at the same time. So I do believe that India is playing its own card, trying to maneuver. But his argument about the BRICS and G7 and G20, for me, it made sense. But the argument about the Quad and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, kind of, it's really not strong for me, in the sense where the Quad is a security alignment. It's a security alliance, really security-centered alliance. So are you going to be on two security alliance where one is, even though they don't mention it all the time, but one is really targeting into containing and countering one of your neighbor for which you have a very difficult kind of relation, and at the same time finding yourself in the same kind of similar kind of situation with that exact neighbor for similar kind of cooperation. This is where it sports somehow doesn't really make sense to me. I understand for economic purposes, politic purposes, BRICS and everything, J7, G20 makes sense. But when it comes to security, knowing that those two organizations are working for two different and clear opposite goals in a certain extent, it's becoming more difficult to justify India's position to being on the two core security infrastructure at the same time. And I think that's why. Yeah.
I mean, you say that, but Jaishankar just literally responded to that, saying we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can have a relationship with China, and we can have a relationship with the Quad, and we can be part of the BRICS.
How would you explain, for example, if the Quad decide to take action on the South China Sea issues against China? And at the same time, how India is going to position itself in that kind of situation?
I mean, India's position on the South China Sea is very clear. It's fully aligned with the U.S. in terms of freedom of navigation, going back to the 2016 tribunal ruling. I mean, it's 100% aligned with where everybody else is, and I think they're safe because they have safety in numbers on that.
But in the case of military intervention, will India, being now part of that coalition, that's going to intervene military in that crisis?
Let's be very careful here. The Quad is not guaranteed to interfere. Only the United States
I'm just
has a security
hypothetical.
alliance. And but the Quad. But I think India would stay out of that conflict. I don't think they would get in. And being a member of the Quad would not obligate them to become involved in a South China Sea crisis should one materialize. So they would be able to say, that's not for us.
In the first place, I think this kind of making everyone anxious by very, very clearly kind of like diversifying your relationships, that is an Indian, like they're very good at it. It's like one of their superpowers. So that's clearly also what they're doing. And to a certain extent, I have to say, I find it a little encouraging. Because we know that a lot of the discussion that's driving some of the Quad decisions are happening in Washington by people who are at best indifferent to Asia's welfare, right? So so I think so maintaining both of those connections at least sends the signal that India remains in a more kind of broad-based kind of conversation with a larger part of the neighborhood.
Why do you say?
Because otherwise it becomes everything narrowed towards kind of like to U.S. concerns, I think.
But why do you say at best indifferent to Asia's welfare? I mean, the United States has a stake. I mean, we do more trade with Asia than we do with any other part of the world. Asia being stable and vibrant is to our national security and to our economic security very important.
Yes, but I was also recently in DC and I was struck by the sports teamification of the discussion, right? Kind of like, if like, oh, their team has this and this, our team has this and this, we can take them out here and there. It's like, yeah, these are actual countries with actual people. This isn't a theater of action. Like that is what I mean. It's like there's like strategic tunnel vision that dominates the conversation in DC at the moment, which I do think is like shows a certain level of indifference to, for example, what happens to the actual people of Taiwan.
And the reality is also the fact that Asia is far. Any deflagration, any conflict will never touch the US, will be so far from the US that they can still it's really easy to talk about it at a distance, what's happening in Asia, because they are not impacted by that. They are not touched by the guns. They won't. Yeah. That's the reality of it. That's the reality. So this is the part where at some point it's easy, as we say, as you mentioned, Kobus, it's easy for people in DC to talk about it with so much distance, as if you are talking about pawns on the table, like this and that, because you know that whatever happened there, whatever deflagration will happen there, will never touch us, and we can easily do that. That's why I think that, and this is one of the comments I've made about those crises in Southeast Asia. I do believe that at some point, Southeast Asian countries are going to have to find a solution themselves, really work on finding a solution themselves, because the reality is, as much as US can be allied to Philippines, to India, to Japan and everything, if anything comes to happen, the US will never be impacted by that. And I'm talking from an African perspective where we've seen wars happening, countries being bombarded because people somewhere in Europe decided it was good for us to be bombarded, but never got impacted by the bombardment that we got in Africa. So yes, I do believe that if Asians are listening, should be very careful about that.
Exactly, and where those very wars, those proxy wars of the Cold War, is now frequently entirely erased in the conversation, and you frequently hear people talking about a unique window of peace in ensured by the Pax Americana for all those years. I'm like, oh, really? Like we still have the landmines, from the old Cold War in the ground.
Exactly, we still have your landmines here. Come on.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, and
come and get
so
them.
how much? Okay, so. We really riled you two up today. So how much of the frustration about the West, quote unquote, and we talk about the global West, just like the global South, Australia and Japan are part of the global West, if you will, is because of historical wrongs and injustices and hypocrisies, and how much of it is based on contemporary issues in your view?
Well, I think unfortunately the Israel crisis smashes those two together and makes clear that you can't really make that distinction, I think.
Yeah. Okay. At the end, it's a mix. It's a mix of all of them. It's a mix of historical past, present situation, and the present situation will always be read against the background of what has been historically established as the West behavior and approach to things. That's why, to come back to China, this is why when China say a new world order, global civilization initiative, all those initiatives, people in the global south is like, yeah, this is what we want. We want, even though in the global south, no one has a clear idea of what that new world order under China would look like.
They just don't like the current one and the past one.
Exactly. But yet people, at least we have someone who's powerful enough to say something and who's really powerful enough to really nudge the change in the direction that we don't want to be in today. And this is something that's why China will always start to have the ear of people in the global south.
I think this is why I tend to talk about Israel as as a really unique challenge, I think, to Western leadership, because what it ended up like cementing is a discourse in that really covers all of kind of Western engagement around the world, that all of this talk of universalist values, all of this is just cover for empire. Like, the Israel crisis has really cemented that discourse, and I think it's going to be very difficult to actually change that back again.
So when you see like the U.S. support for Israel and seemingly as unconditional as it is, I mean, and by the way, this is a wholly bipartisan issue in the United States. There doesn't seem to be any daylight in terms of between Republicans and Democrats in providing support. There is, on the far left, there is obviously a lot of dissent, but the far right also has some issues on this as well. But in the center of the body politic in the United States, 100% unconditional support. When you look at what the United States is doing in Israel, do you then make the comparison of, say, the United States backing the Belgians in the Congo or the United States backing the French in Vietnam? Is that the parallel you're trying to make back in those times? I mean,
yes.
Yeah.
Very much so.
That's it.
So this is just a thread. This is the same
exactly.
thread.
It's like one of those many threads from the same
project.
sources. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. I mean, I think you'll have a lot of Americans who, and again, most Americans aren't very well versed on these issues of. I mean, if you look at an American social studies textbook, it is shocking how shallow and superficial the coverage of the Cold War is, and it's all framed in us against the Soviets, the good guys versus the bad
against
guys,
the bad,
and the collateral damage of all the different countries that you come from and that we're talking about today are largely are ignored. So the fact is that Americans have a very poor literacy on this history. So I think that when Cobus, when you say these things, I have a feeling that people are going to be shocked and surprised and kind of saying, no, I mean, they clutch the pearls. How dare you kind of compare
we are the
us
good guys.
we are the good guys, right? I think that's what you run into in a place like DC when you talk to Americans as well, is that they don't see the connection to history in Israel. They don't see the battle for empire that you're talking about, because when you talk to Americans about empire, they say, no. That was the British. That was the French. That was the Japanese. We did not establish colonies in anywhere near the number that the others did when we could have. We have a military that is so powerful. And so, we have the most powerful military that has ever been created in human history. And yet we didn't use it to create, a traditional empire. So when you talk about this, Cobus, in the context of empire, I think a lot of Americans are going to be feeling very uncomfortable about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
That's why I believe at the end,
think-
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead,
really
Cobus,
believe
and then
that.
we'll Joel.
Gomez, go ahead.
No, kind of I have encountered that, and it's the kind of the formal British style colony system isn't the only way to run an empire. Like and the US's kind of global footprint is a reality. Sorry,
Yeah.
Giro, go ahead.
True. No,
Yeah.
to get back to that
Go ahead,
crisis.
Joel.
To
I got
that
one more
situation.
topic I want to get to. So
Yeah, I think it's that topic of the escalation of India and China. Maybe we're gonna get back to that. But yes, I think that's
yes,
the point
that's our
where-
next topic. But
Yeah. That's I think that's really something, a key moment in China-India relation. If they manage to really de-escalate the situation, things can get much better for Asia and for the Southeast Asia in general. Yeah.
Okay, let's kind of go on to our last topic here. Man, I did not anticipate covering this kind of ground in the show today, but here we are. There has been, way out of sight of a lot of people for the past few weeks, a major thaw in relations between India and China. Now, what's interesting is that in the United States and in India, in some quarters of the media, there's been a backlash. A lot of people are saying, if you think that this is a thaw, then you aren't paying attention and you don't know what you're talking about. The Wall Street Journal, got a little bit, antsy about how, the China and India are starting to kind of talk again. And this is all because back in 2020 and 2021, there were clashes in the Galwan Valley along their disputed border, this huge disputed border high up in the Himalayas. We're talking thousands of kilometers, and there was a clashes there that led to deaths back in 2020. Relations basically were put on ice. And when we talk about the tensions between the U.S. and China, it pales in comparison to what we've seen with India and China. Still with the United States, there are academic exchanges, there are journalists in each other's countries, there are direct flights in each other's countries. There was always a Chinese ambassador and ambassadors in both countries. We're talking over the past 4 years. None of that, all of that went away. Last year or this year, I'm not sure if it was this year or last year, China finally put an ambassador in New Delhi, Xu Feihong. And what we've seen now over the past 3 months is a major kind of toning down of some of the rhetoric. Now, remember at the BRICS summit last year in Johannesburg, where was the BRICS summit? Cape Town or Johannesburg? Johannesburg.
Johannesburg, I think.
Johannesburg. Narendra Modi and Xi Jinping barely looked at each other. At the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit last year, Modi didn't even go to the last one, but the previous one, they literally avoided each other. And it just shows you how cold the ties were between the two countries. Let me just kind of give you a little bit of an indication as to what's going on. And it's really amazing to watch just in the past 2 or 3 weeks of what we've seen with some changes. So at 4 locations along their disputed border, Chinese troops have pulled back. And that is really something that we did not see coming. 75% of the issues related to disengagement, according to S.J. Shankar, have been resolved. Now, a lot of this got into motion after Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met with Ajit Doval, and Ajit Doval is the national security advisor to Narendra Modi. So think of him as the equivalent of Jake Sullivan. And they agreed on the sidelines of a BRICS security forum that they were going to start to disengage things and to start toning things down. Now, at the time when we first saw news of this cross, we thought, yeah, okay. I mean, it's good that they're talking. That's always an encouraging thing, but we didn't really quite know what was going to happen. Since then, again, we have seen the removal of Chinese troops from 4 points along the line of actual control. We have seen also a resumption of talks between the two sides for aviation links to be restored. And so these are, in my view, these are very substantive. And let me, tell you what I think is going on here. I think that in the context of the South China Sea confrontation, which is showing no signs of de-escalating, and at the same time, I think that the Indian economy and the Chinese economy both could benefit from deeper economic engagement. Remember, Modi is in his 3rd term now. He cannot run for re-election again under normal circumstances. So he can take risks that he couldn't do when he was running up for re-election. Modi wants to further industrialize India. He wants Chinese investment. He sees Chinese, manufacturing coming into the country. He sees the China Plus One strategy with companies like Apple and even Lenovo now just set up factories there. And I think there's benefits to Modi on that. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is in the context of what we've talked about in terms of empire and BRICS and G7 and all of this. If the Chinese and the Indians get back to some type of normalcy, it really complicates the great power competition in Asia. It really complicates the Quad. It really complicates a lot of the narratives that have come out of the West, because with India firmly locked in opposition to the Chinese on so many initiatives, that gave the United States a lot more room to maneuver. To be sure, and just before I get any comments on YouTube and otherwise, these countries are not going to be hugging each other anytime soon. They still face very serious territorial disputes along the northern border. There's a fierce competition underway for influence in places like Sri Lanka, also for influence in the Indian Ocean basin. So I don't want to make this lovey-dovey and some kind of, ignorant white guy kind of saying peace and kumbaya is breaking out. We're seeing a de-escalation of tensions from where they were just frozen to thawing out a little bit. And that could be significant. Cobus, do you share my enthusiasm of the magnitude of what this is, or is there a chance that I'm reading too much into it?
No, I think even if they only de-escalated a little bit, it still is significant. I think because these are these huge populations, huge economies. Both have massive militaries. So so just kind of like dialing the tension a bit down, I think is just good for everyone. And it's also, as you say, it also then I think, kind of brings it, like complexifies the security situation there. Also, maybe in a useful way, kind of in the sense that I do think it is helpful to have more channels of communication between these countries, because they at least are embedded in this neighborhood. They're not going anywhere. So that kind of like a solution for how all of these different very, very complicated Asian security and territory kind of disputes have to be resolved, have to eventually be an Asian decision. So I think this at least hopefully takes us a little bit in that direction, depending on what happens.
And I think the South China Sea issue plays into this in the sense that they can demonstrate to the Philippines to say, this is how we can resolve a border issue. Without the United States, without the intervention of the international community. So I think that she may be wanting to telegraph that. Whether or not this gets done, whether or not that transmits to somewhere like the Philippines, different story, but that may be part of the Chinese motivation. Go ahead, Jerome.
Yeah, some analysts have been saying that China has made a mistake to antagonize India for the last 4 or 5 years, that it was, given the current context, given the current international context, it should have really finding a way to dial down the ballistic narrative they've been having in the region. And it's only going to play good for China to have one less country to worry about, one less superpower in your own neighborhood, in your own backyard, to be mad at you. And if they manage to really thaw the situation, to have a certain sense of communication, a certain sense of normalcy, definitely they will really dial down the tension. That will also keep away any kind of influence that may come in and really start to influence the conversation. And when I think of that, I thought of that the hot mic situation that happened during the Quad meeting this week, when they say, you know, in China is testing us. And when I was like, and just few days before you have that thawing happening between India and China, and you go to DC, you go to Washington, you go to the US, Joe Biden caught in the hot mic saying that China is testing us. Some would say, you see, this is a country that's really trying to put fire in the region where we are trying ourselves to dial down our situation, to dial down our crisis. And this is how those kind of narrative gonna play against the US, and they're gonna say that, you know, the US is not helping us to build peace. In contrary, they're trying to fuel the tension between us, so we are always at odds with each other. So that's why I believe that in India and China situation, that's more a relation that's much more calm, cool, where they communicate, where they talk, where they put framework of communication, of resolving tension, of resolving crisis, is really something in the good direction. So how long it's going to take to materialize, this is something else. But having that, it's always a good thing for me.
And let's be very clear here, is that public sentiment in large swaths of Indian society, whether it's in the media, the academic sector, and in the think tank community, is decidedly anti-Chinese. I mean, you know, it's funny because you oftentimes hear the Chinese talk about the propagation of the debt trap accusation coming out of the United States, and you're like,
it came from India.
So much of that is coming from out of India. And you look at Indian media, and they're kind of on China.
He's just
why on all of them? I mean, it's just, I mean, they're next level in their kind of, you know, their just acidic approach on anything Chinese. So we may see a diplomatic kind of toning down of the rhetoric. We may see a restoration of academic exchanges, people-to-people exchanges, aviation links restored, but it's going to take a long time to get Indian society kind of to calm down a little bit and to see this as anything positive in that sense. I mean, the media narratives coming out of India and China are just off the charts.
But the funny thing with the two countries, like those two countries, all countries in the global south have similar past and experience about Western interference, Western colonization, and all of that. So basically, you know, from an historical perspective, they should be fighting the same fight of, you know, being much more independent, being the one deciding for their own future. And that's why I do believe that if they do manage to really solve the crisis, they solve the issue, they can really make the BRICS a powerful entity, because it's going to be something major of importance, because the both of them, they can really be carrying the narrative of like, we are all global south countries, we represent half of the world population, the both of us, and we know what Western interference means to our country, and we really want to fight for a new world order, we want to fight for a new international context, new international system. They can really be forces for change if they work together. But yeah, they have regional fights.
In my view, that's
they have too much
too ambitious.
They have too much regional fights between them, and regional ambitions that I do think that they're not like the US and Canada. Sorry, no, Canadian, but yeah.
But we're not going to get, oh yeah, don't go down that lad. Okay, Cobus, last word is going to go to you. Last word goes to you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, kind of basically echoing Giroux's, you know, point that, you know, if they could work together, find ways of working together more effectively, then that I think will be probably good for everyone.
Okay.
And it will certainly, hopefully, kind of like cool down some of these kind of worrying issues in a region where there's already too many such worrying issues. I think it's going to be very interesting to see where, if there is a greater cooperation between them, where that leaves Pakistan, because of course Pakistan has been very much kind of positioning itself, in the context of this conflict. So that'll be interesting. And then
But
also,
China's not going to
US
back away from Pakistan on any issue. And again, Pakistan is a player in all of this because in many ways you're going to want to. India getting closer to China might be a way to try and box Pakistan out of some things. But the China-Pakistan relationship is shown itself to be extraordinarily resilient, and so I don't see that kind of hedging in any way. So
but I think overall it is still part of the kind of walking and chewing gum situation, right? It's kind of like doing all things at once. It's like de-escalating stuff with India doesn't imply any changes in some of these other things, So
right.
And I think that both China and India are good at those kind of complicated games.
Okay, guys, that was good. That went a little bit longer than I expected. Very lively show, very unpredictable. That's what we do when we do the live shows.
We have some comment from people, though.
We have more comments this week. I'm just afraid to get into the comments because they're all amazingly
I think let's
good
give
questions.
them 5 minutes, like straight 5 minutes. I think they're gonna appreciate it.
Okay.
Otherwise, they say they are there, but we never respond. So because I see a guy here saying that a guy called Vinny said, I've been saying this for a while, talking about China-India situation. I've been saying this for a while, that the West would be making a big mistake if they think that they can rely on the tension between China and India. It's not that much of a big of a problem. If the Chinese needs to, they will give a lot concession to India. I think that, Eric, you don't share the point of view. The tension is too high for China to make major concession to India in that regard.
Well, just pulling back the troops was a major concession. I mean, pulling back military forces from the line of actual control in 4 different locations, I think has to be seen as a concession. I mean, there's just no way to look at it. Let's see. We have another one from Dr. Alpana V. Everything comes down to the theory of survival of the fittest, as proposed by Charles Darwin, and hence all powers strive hard to evolve, be it their foreign policies or any strategic outlook. It would be great if either of the speakers could comment on that. Survival of the fittest. Cobus,
with all due respect, we're not living in 1906. Like Darwinism,
but we are living in a world where
geopolitical Darwinism is dead.
You say that though, Cobus, but we are living in a world where if I have more guns than you do, I get to tell you what to do.
If I have the nuclear weapons, I'm gonna tell you what to do, and you don't attack me.
Well, I mean, no, but it's just power and strength drive politics. If China was a backwards poor country like it was in 1975, it wouldn't be able to do what it's doing today.
And the assertiveness they have now is because of that as well.
But this is why Darwinism is such a useless kind of frame for this kind of discussion, because Darwinism is about it's based on inherent characteristics of species, right? Kind of that's what the thinking is about. It's not about tool use, which is what weapons accumulation is about, or capitalism, which weapons is also about. It's about like some species are just this kind of fiction that some species are just like born better than others, which is of course why Darwinism was so instrumental in racism, around the world. So it's nonsense. Sorry.
Another comment came, I think it's come from Richard. I don't know if he's from Asia. He was saying, here's my perspective. The Western leadership of the US priority is domination. The agenda is the creation of a NATO military alliance. Asia don't need military alliance to solve our own problem. Yes, yeah.
He can say that, but listen, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, they all have made sovereign decisions to be allies with the United States. He says that, but at the end of the day, these are sovereign countries making sovereign decisions. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Thailand. I mean, go down the list of countries. Even Prabowo in Indonesia has very close ties with the U.S. military. So I don't know. That feels like, sure. But at the end of the day, these countries are saying we do want to have a security relationship with the United States.
I'm gonna throw something to the US. If China today come to sign a military alliance with Mexico, I wonder if the feelings will be the same in DC.
it's kind of like the Darwin issue. I mean, at the end of the day, it's never going to happen. So because China doesn't do alliances,
We never know.
No, China doesn't do alliances. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It only has an alliance with North Korea, and also China. That's just not the way the Chinese operate. You know, they're not going to put a mutual security guarantee with Mexico because they don't have the capacity to back that up. I mean, they just don't have the military capacity to do that at this point. They may in a future point, but right now they actually can't project power that far afield. You know, I mean, listen, we've been through this before with the United States, and the Soviet Union came aggressively into the Western Hemisphere. I mean, the entire U.S. government was kind of built around, you know, confronting that. I suspect today would be very different because the U.S. is such a broken, fractured, fragmented society, unlike it was during the Cold War, that I think mounting a defense, you know, like that would be much harder today because you wouldn't be able to get a societal consensus on that. So last question: illegal mining by Chinese actors complicates Nigeria's criminal landscape. What's your opinion on this? Go ahead, Jérôme. We'll put that one to you.
Yes, we had the similar situation in Ghana as well. I was even reading in the DRC as well. So it's really complicating everything everywhere. I mean, you have all those private Chinese entities engaging in illegal mining in those regions, and I'm gonna throw back the responsibility to local authorities in a sense that they don't do that out of the vacuum. They do that with the support and protection of some very powerful local leaders in those countries. So I do believe that, yes, we see the visible part of the responsibility that the Chinese are doing there because, you know, there's private entities and chasing for mining gold because it's easy. But I think the responsibility should start to be being put on local authorities because all those Chinese, when they come, they have legal documents, they have paperwork, they have everything. They come protected. Some of them, when you go to those mining sites, they're protected by military, by people in arms. The question is, who's protecting them? Who are guarding them? So this is telling you that, yes, behind all those artisanal local Chinese minings being present, there's always in all those countries, there's always one powerful local person protecting them. And those are the people that we should go after.
This also goes back to the beginning of our conversation about context. That when you look at the Galamsey in Ghana, and when you look at the numbers of people being arrested for illegal mining in Ghana, they had some data a year or two ago, and the Nigerians were far larger than the Chinese. The Chinese were a relatively small part. When you look at other West Africans who are engaged in illegal mining, it really shows that this is less about the Chinese, and to your point, Giraud, more about the collapse of enforcement,
states,
the
governance,
weak state
and
capacity.
Yeah.
That's right. And so I think the Chinese stand out. They are easy.
Yeah, because of their skin, they're easy to spot.
Well,
they're easy
to spot. But at the end of the day, the problem is much deeper than the Chinese, and the problem is ultimately rooted in weak state capacity on the part of Nigerian, Ghanaian, and other governments. That is,
definitely,
I mean, that's the issue. I mean, you can, because at the end of the day, you can, you know, crack down on the Chinese all you want, but that's not going to solve the problem if you have illegal mining going on by everybody else.
Exactly.
And, I mean, so you still have that problem. So I think picking on the Chinese, it makes for good politics. I think it makes for good media coverage. But I think at the end of the day, the problem is anchored in the local kind of governance. In Ghana, interestingly enough, in the last time, remember we were doing our coverage of Aisha Wong, the so-called Galamsey Queen, and on TV, so much of it was Aisha Wong could not have been successful without chieftains and without local policymakers giving her the pathway to do it.
Yeah.
That's so.
But the reality.
Okay. We're over time, but we got some questions in. That was great. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for joining us on this Friday afternoon. We're going to try and do this every Friday. You know, we're still kind of figuring out the tools to do it, so there's a little glitches here and there, but we appreciate your patience. And also just want to invite everybody to join us on our audio podcast that we produce. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can watch all of the shows there on YouTube. Thank you to everybody who provides their comments and listens. We really appreciate it. And also thank you to everybody who subscribes to the China Global South Project. And if you want to check out who we are and what we do, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com. So thanks so much. We'll be back again, hopefully next week, maybe the week after, but hopefully next week with another edition of the live CGSP Roundtable. So for Giraud in Mauritius and Cobus in Cape Town, I'm Eric in Ho Chi Minh City. We'll see you again next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.